All right, and we're back. We just recorded a video. If you haven't watched it, go watch it on the first recording on Wellman. It was about Wellman, and it was also maybe more truly about how to formulate and why to formulate arguments in valid form when you're summarizing the argument from an excerpt. It's really important to be really precise in terms of what he's actually arguing for and differentiating that from other things. So he's arguing that countries have the right to restrict immigration in virtually any way that they want to. Now, there's going to be an exception. We'll talk about one exception that he admits at the end. But to be clear, let's talk about how that's different from similar claims in the area, but that are really importantly and deeply different. Saying that countries have the right to restrict immigration is different from saying that countries ought to restrict immigration, right? So saying you have the right to destroy your house if you want to, which you have if you own that house, I guess, and you're not imperiling anyone else, is different, very obviously different from saying you should burn down your house, right? And both of those things are different from saying that it's prudent or that it's good to burn down your house, right? It's a little harder to come up with scenarios where it could be that you should do it even though it's not good. Maybe you should do it. There are clear cases where you should do it, but it's not prudent. It's not good for you, right? It's not in your best interest, right? Maybe you have to do it to save, maybe there's a fire, and if you burn your house down, the fire won't be able to jump and get to the other houses in the neighborhood or something like that. It's not prudent. It's not in your interest, but it is something you should do. Let's see if I can come up with a case where you should do it, but it's not good. That's actually harder. That's actually a lot harder. Let's not deal with the hard questions here. This is philosophy after all. But then you can do all these different little games where you come up with scenarios where you could come up with one where it's prudent, but you shouldn't do it, right? It could be prudent to burn your house down, but you still shouldn't because it's not good for everybody else that lives in your house or something like that. Maybe it's good for you. It's in your best interest because, I don't know, you get some insurance money or something. I don't know. Yeah, that might be a case right there. Yeah, so maybe it could be in your best interest because you know you could get away with it and you could get the insurance money and you'd get a ton of money, et cetera, et cetera. But you shouldn't do it because that's dishonest. Again, all of these things are just cases that I'm trying to give you to show how all these different claims that initially seemed really similar actually come apart. And in their coming apart, you're able to see exactly how different they are. Wellman says we have the right, or countries have the right to restrict immigration. He says also, he does not mean by that it's good for them to do it in every case. He in fact thinks there's lots of cases where it's not good, or that it's prudent. He thinks in lots of cases it's imprudent. It's against a country's interest to restrict immigration, but they still have the right to do it. And again, we could come up with lots of cases where to show the difference between having a right to do something and it being good or prudent, or us having an obligation to do it. But he's just making this, I think, pretty guarded, pretty narrow claim that we have the right to do it. Countries have the right to restrict immigration in virtually any way they want. Okay, so given that, I'm going to start talking about Wellman's argument. At a certain point, I'm going to screen share and just show you a totally unrelated video just to break up the time and keep you awake. It's my little brother's favorite YouTube video. So let's talk about Wellman a little bit, and then we'll get to that. These kinds of cases. Do the Girl Scouts have the right to exclude boys? Do the Boy Scouts have the right to exclude girls? Again, I'm sort of inspired there by recent events. I don't know if y'all know, but the Boy Scouts no longer exists anymore. It's now, I believe, called Scouts of America because they admit girls now. So that's sort of what inspired these questions. As far as I know, the Girl Scouts still exist and exclude boys. Christian student groups on campus have the right to exclude non-Christians. That one, do Muslim student groups on campus have the right to exclude practicing homosexuals from leadership? So, and again, you could even ask the same question, making it mirror the Christian question: do Muslim student groups on campus have the right to exclude non-Muslims from leadership or from membership even? Okay, these are all cases, if you can kind of get the common strain here, where a group decides to exclude a class of people from their group. And maybe they run the spectrum of being more justified versus less justified. But regardless, Wellman thinks, regardless of whether it's good for these groups to do this or whether it's in their best interest, they do have the right to do it. Okay, what does he think that? Well, he kind of argues from association. So individuals have the freedom of association. He thinks we're all going to grant this. I actually think he's right about that, unless you deny the most basic tenets of liberalism. And again, by liberalism, I mean basically any political system which prizes freedom of its citizens. That's, I mean, rough, I guess. There's probably more technical definitions than that. So I'm not liberalism here in the broad sense, not in the liberal versus conservative sense. If you have been raised in a liberal democracy, like many of us have, then you're going to find this really intuitive, because the core tenet of a liberal society is that we have the right to act as we please within very broad constraints. Maybe the constraints are that, well, you have the ability to act as you please. The way some people put it, unless you infringe on someone else's ability to act as they please, or something like that. The way John Stuart Mill put it, one of the kind of classic formulations of liberalism, is that there are no permissible restrictions on individuals' freedoms unless they are going to directly harm another person by their actions without that person's consent. Again, UFC fighters are directly harming other people, but we do that because there was consent. So that's liberalism. And if you believe that people should be allowed to do what they want as long as they're not directly harming someone without that person's consent, then you should agree that we have the freedom of association. That people should be free to marry who they want, to join whatever religion they want, to say what they want, to live where they want. At least they shouldn't be kept from doing those things by other people. I mean, there are going to be factors that keep you from living where you want in a lot of cases, but those won't be intentional constraints by people. Okay, and he thinks, look, that much is for certain. And then you can view his argument as an argument from analogy that, look, why not think that groups have the same right? Groups are just groups of people, and people have the freedom of association. So why not think, and honestly, you don't even have to argue from an analogy here. It just seems, once you get clear on what we're arguing for, or what Wellman is arguing for, it seems clear that we think lots of groups have the right to exclude. I mean, if a golf club decides, you know what, we only want 100 members, okay, yeah, technically we could take 200 more, but whatever, we don't want it to be crowded or something like that. Everybody's going to say, oh, okay, cool. Nobody's going to say, no, let's get the cops in here and make sure that you let more people in. Nobody's going to say that. And maybe more controversially, I mean, I think the Boy Scout case is a little controversial just because I think that they got federal funding. And so you might think there are weird things going on there, right? But in terms of just private citizen groups, churches, religions, etc., if there's, say there's a mosque, and again, I don't have a real clear picture of how individual mosques work, but say there's a mosque that you want to visit, you want to go to, but they require a certain dress code for you to go in the mosque. Right? And in fact, for you to be part of their organization, they require you not only to wear that dress code to visit, but certainly to be a member. Is anybody going to say, look, the mosque is on private land, whatever, it's owned by the people who attend it? Is anybody going to say, you can't do that? No, they have the right to say, whatever, cover your head when you come in, or, whatever. You're also free not to come, right? If you don't want to do that, then you don't have to come. So it looks like we think that groups of individuals have the right to restrict membership or their association. Groups have the freedom of association. Wellman talks about, and then Wellman goes to the country level, an even bigger level than the private citizen group. It says, look at countries. America can't be forced to include nations in NAFTA. It's only if we want them in it and they also want to be in it. In that sense, it functions just like a group of citizens, except the countries are huge groups of citizens, and they themselves are the members of the organizations like NAFTA or whatever. Okay, if you want to see the argument, this is going to be familiar to you if you just watched the last video I just made. Here it is. So take a look at it. You can pause on this if you want to, because I'm fixing to run to that YouTube. Hopefully this will work. This is my little brother's favorite YouTube video.
Chipped, cleaned up after, de-sexed, leashed, not allowed on the beaches or in the parks outside certain hours. So how is it that these two are roaming their neighbourhood, frightening the locals, and the council isn't stopping it?
Now, yesterday morning, I came out into the front yard and the dogs were across the road. And as soon as they saw me, they came bounding over. And I just made it into the front door.
Back to our PowerPoint. Share without audio this time because we don't need it. Again, this, like I have tried to emphasize in the last video, this is a really complicated way of formulating the main argument of that first section of Wellman. There's pluses and minuses to doing it this way as opposed to the simpler way I did it on the prior video. One of the benefits and why I'm using it here is that it includes more information and more of the more structure of the argument. So basically, this is an argument ultimately from individuals' right to autonomy, which again, as I just tried to argue, is sort of foundational to liberal societies. That's sort of the whole, it doesn't get any deeper than that. That is the bedrock of any liberal society. That is what makes a society liberal, emphasizing individual autonomy, having an utmost respect for it. But then there's these two steps that get you from individual autonomy to the right not to form associations. So the right to freedom of association is just a special case of the right to autonomy, and the right to freedom of association includes the right to not form association. That's part of what freedom of association means, is that you don't have to form any. Not only do you get to form the associations you want, but you don't have to form associations you don't want. And so look, we get this what's called a subsidiary conclusion. So what we learn from 1, 2, 3. 4 is telling us, it's kind of summarizing what we get from 1, 2, and 3. Individuals have the right not to form associations with anyone for any reason. Now, we can think about whether there are any exceptions to that. Okay, but let's get through the rest of the argument first. 5, if individuals have the right to autonomy, then so do groups of individuals. And the way this argument works, it could be even more complicated because there's a couple of steps left out here. what this establishes is that groups have the right to autonomy, and then if you wanted to, you could work through steps 2 and 3 again. Well, if groups have the right to autonomy, well then that right includes the right to freedom of association, which includes the right not to form associations. But then we're just skipping to 6 here. We're relying on 2 and 3. So if you combine premises 2, 3, and 5, we get to 6. Groups have the right not to form associations with anyone for any reason. And countries are just groups of people, y'all. I don't know if y'all knew that, but it's a little more controversial than it sounds, actually. But that's sort of what Wellman is going on here, and it's totally intuitive. I mean, that's what else is a country except a group of people, you know? So if groups have the right, normal groups of people have the right not to form associations, then so do countries. And that's our conclusion. Countries have the right not to form associations with anyone for any reason they want. And we'll talk about an exception to that last claim. But that gets you the conclusion. Letting someone immigrate and become a citizen is a form of becoming associated with them. They have come into your association. This is kind of a weird way of talking. It's not the way we normally talk about making someone a citizen, but it's a way of bringing them into your organization or your association. Association just being a group of people. And so if we have the right not to form associations with anyone, then we have the right not to accept citizens for whatever reason we want. Wellman argues, that is. Okay, so again, last video, excuse me. Let me take a sip of this. Last video, I talked about some of the benefits of being able to regiment an argument out in premise conclusion form like this. And I said one of them is that you can talk about the author's support for each premise. We're not going to do that right now. In fact, by making the argument more complex than simple, we've actually built some of the support into the argument here. But one of the benefits I said was that it lets you get more clear about what your problems with the argument are. So let's assume I don't like this conclusion. I don't agree with this. I think no, countries, they actually do not have the right to restrict immigration in any way they want. Maybe they can restrict it in some ways, but they have to let people immigrate, or at least certain groups of people that meet certain basic conditions maybe. Maybe my view is, you know what, I think if you don't have a criminal record, you should be allowed to become a citizen of any country. And if a country doesn't do that, they're doing the wrong thing. They don't have the right to restrict immigration over and above not being a felon or something like that. Maybe that's my view. But then I want to know, but Wellman just gave me this argument. How does it work? I mean, I clearly don't accept the conclusion. So where's the problem? So now I can go through each of these premises and say, okay, well, is my problem that individuals don't actually have a right to autonomy? Am I going to deny premise 1? And I'll say, no, I'm still a liberal in the broad sense. I still believe in people's freedoms. So I don't want to deny that. And I actually don't think I want to deny that autonomy includes the right to freedom of association. I believe individuals have the freedom of association. But then I might get to premise 3, for example. This is just an example. I might get to premise 3 and say, you know what? This might be where the problem is. I think that we have the freedom of association, but it doesn't include the right to not form associations with anyone for any reason. I think you can have the freedom of association and still not have the right to say, I don't want to form an association with that person, at least in some cases. And are there any cases like that? Are there any cases where we actually don't have the right to not form an association with someone for a certain reason? I guess I'm thinking of cases where, so what we need outside of the jargon that kind of got really wordy, we're looking at cases where someone can justifiably be forced to join an association or to enter into some sort of relationship with another person or another group of people. I'm thinking of the draft. That might be a case. I have the freedom of association, but there are exceptions. I had to join Selective Service when I was 18, or whatever it's called. And certainly, I mean, maybe you don't agree with that, but you agree with the draft in certain exceptional scenarios. Maybe you agreed with it in World War II. If, say, we have another World War II type situation where there's a just war happening and we don't have enough people in the military, you might think, yeah, citizens of a country engaged in a just war that they can't avoid, where they don't have enough people in the military, can enlist people via the draft. That is being forced into an association against your will in many cases, or independently of your will, at least. Even if you're okay with it, they don't care that you're okay with it, right? So you're being forced into an association with the U.S. military. Does that mean you don't have the freedom of association, or that your freedom of association has been abridged? No, it just means that there are exceptions to your freedom of association. So look, if that was my problem, if I said I don't agree with this conclusion, I was able to work in this fictional scenario. I'm not saying these are my actual opinions. I was able to work through this argument once I had it regimented out like that and say, oh, my problem was actually with premise 3. And independently of that, premise 3 doesn't seem totally obvious, right? For that reason, you can have a right and there can be exceptions to that right. So, or you can have a right to freedom of association and still not have the right to not form associations with anyone for any reason. Okay. Or you might have a problem with premise 5, and I'll leave it to y'all. I don't want to belabor this, make this video too long. But you might have a problem with premise 5 and say, yeah, there's big differences between individuals and groups, such that individuals do have the right to autonomy, but groups do not. Or maybe the groups do have a right to autonomy, but it's a weaker right, or something like that. Or you might even get crazy and deny premise 7 that countries are just groups of people. You might say that countries are more than just groups of people. They're institutions and laws and things like that. All those things go into a country. I don't know. My point being, these are the places where the argument might be weak. Okay, one last thing. This distinction, which may come up more, let's call this done. That's the main argument. Let's call what we're transitioning to, bonus points or just for kicks. This is to talk about some of the nuance of Wellman's argument that goes beyond the main thrust of the argument. So if your head is kind of spinning and you're like, man, I just need to focus on this right now, you do that. You do you, whatever. But just to give you a little more nuance in case you're wondering, well, first we'll do the nuance, and then we're going to come back and talk about one exception that Wellman has to his claim. He thinks there actually is one exception, that a case where countries cannot justifiably restrict immigration in any way they choose. But for now, let's take this little detour, whatever, chill out if this is too much. Wellman makes this distinction, or he actually doesn't make the distinction, he relies on the distinction without making it, between absolute and, here's a cool Latin word for you, prima facie rights. Prima facie is Latin for, oh gosh, what is it Latin for? On its face, basically. Doesn't really matter. Here's your definitions. An absolute right cannot be overridden. You morally cannot violate it. Prima facie right can be overridden by sufficiently weighty considerations. So think of prima facie right as it's sort of like you've got your weight, the old school, as if you have a prima facie right, it's weighing this, right? But it could be outweighed. If you have other considerations which are even weightier, then it's going to be something that you can violate, quote unquote. It wouldn't count as a violation, I guess. But what are some cases? A case of an absolute right it's actually kind of hard to think of one, because you might say your right to life, but there are cases where your right to life can be overridden, right? Whether there's a distinction between your right being overridden and there being an exception to your right is kind of hard for me to think about. There's certainly exceptions written into your right to life, like if you commit a certain kind of crime, maybe, if you believe in capital punishment, that is. Certainly, if you are making an assault on someone else's life who is innocent, then you have, maybe you want to say it as you forfeited your right to life. Maybe you say there's an exception written into your right that says but no, you can actually be killed in that situation if it's required to protect this other person that you're assaulting, or mortally assaulting. But anyway, prima facie rights are just those that can be overridden. So it's something like, if you have a prima facie right to freedom of speech, then it counts. You should be allowed to say what you want unless sufficiently weighty considerations arise, like maybe you're going to create a panic or something like that. That would override your prima facie right to freedom of speech, if that right is a prima facie right. And this is important for Wellman's argument, again, just to make this quick, because he thinks that the strength of the prima facie right, or in our analogy, how much it weighs down that side of the justice scale or whatever, depends on how important the kind of association involved is when we're talking about the right to association. And so you might think the intimacy and the importance of marriage makes the right to association there, the right to freedom of association there, very strong. It would take a lot to outweigh it, a ton, really, if you think about it. What would it take to outweigh our right to choose who we marry and to choose who we end a marriage with? I don't know. It's really hard for me to think of such a case. What would it take to justify forcing someone into a marriage or not letting them end a marriage? That's hard. Think about that. That's because the importance of marriage makes that right, or the weightiness of marriage makes the right very strong there. The intimacy between fellow citizens, he says, is not nearly as strong as the intimacy or the importance of marriage. And so our right to freedom of association might be weaker there. And this is maybe a weakness of his argument, right? Because he's trying to argue by analogy from individuals having rights to groups having the same rights. But wait, we just saw the individual rights are way stronger than the group rights, if this is right. But he wants to say, look, it's still pretty strong. The importance of the association between citizens is still pretty strong. It's going to determine lots of aspects of your life, who composes your country, right? Because obviously we're a democracy, so the people get to decide largely what happens. So if you make certain immigration decisions, the course of the country will change, right? Or so Wellman argues. And that's why the association of being fellow citizen is actually still really important. And you could think about that a lot and come up with lots of different ways that being in an association with a fellow citizen, as opposed to association with someone as a marital spouse, is still pretty important. Not quite as important by any means, but still pretty important. Anyway, okay. So, let's get past that wrinkle. And let's talk about this exclusion he includes. So someone might object to Wellman and say, wait a second, doesn't your argument entail that it's justifiable for countries to exclude people on the basis of race or religion or sex or sexual orientation or something like that? Doesn't that mean, to put it in the starkest terms, that it would be okay for us to say, for just to take an example, for the U.S. to say, we are going to allow immigration, but not if you're gay. Or we're going to allow immigration, but not if you're Asian. We're going to allow immigration, but not if you're a woman, or not if you're a man. We're going to allow immigration, but not if you're Muslim, or not if you're Hindu, or not if you're Jewish, or something like this. Doesn't Wellman's argument, the objector might say, entail that all of those are things that countries have the right to? Now, again, we don't want to unfairly characterize him. His argument does not entail that those are good things, that they are prudent things, or that they're things that countries ought to do, right? He's going to say it's totally open to him, and for what he's argued, to say, oh, those are bad, it's imprudent, it's bad for your country, you shouldn't do it. But the question is, do you have the right to? And it might be an objection to his argument to say, your argument entails, still just being fair to what you've said, that we have the right, countries have the right to exclude people for those reasons. Let me go back to screen share here. Bad. And he admits, yeah, that seems like a bad consequence of the argument. But he wants to say, no, and again, this is actually in a part of the article that y'all didn't read, so if this is sounding alien, it's because it is. He thinks that he has a reply to this objection. He thinks that this is one exception to a state's or a country's right to restrict immigration. And here's what he says. If the U.S., for example, were to say, we don't want Muslims, we're going to restrict immigration so that we don't have any Muslims coming in, he'd say that would be unjustifiable. We don't have the right to do that. Why? Because we have Muslims in this country. And here's how his argument goes. He says, look, it would be an abridgment of American Muslims' rights. They deserve to be treated with dignity. But if we were to if we were to formulate an immigration policy that said we don't want Muslims, we are not treating American Muslims that are already here with the dignity they deserve, and equally with other citizens. Does that make sense? Well, y'all aren't there. You can answer. And he gives this family analogy. He says something like this, paraphrasing. Imagine, I'm going to stop sharing here. Imagine that I had a family, and say I had adopted a kid, let's say from Argentina. And again, anyway, so let's say that had happened. And now whatever, we're good. Now I want to adopt another kid. I guess I'm Angelina Jolie or something. I want to adopt another child. And for some reason, the American foster system is not good enough for me. And so, again, I want to do an international adoption. And I say, I want to adopt a kid, but no Argentinians, right? If that were to happen, if I were to do that, look, do I have the right to adopt or not adopt as I so please? Yes. But in that case, it's an affront and a violation even maybe to my child, my adopted Argentinian child, for me to decide that I don't want to adopt. I want to adopt, but just not Argentinians, right? So it would be unjustifiable, and I do not have the right to restrict my adoption policy in that way, because it would be an affront and a violation somehow, in some sense, to my current child. And it's nothing about the kid from Argentina that I would adopt, the second one, the second possible adoption that I'm thinking about in the future. It's all about the kid that I actually have, and it being, somehow offensive or a violation to him or her. And similarly, Wellman says, the reason countries can't restrict immigration policies on the basis of religion, sex, sexual orientation, etc., is because it is an abridgment of the rights and of the equality of those citizens who are already in the country that are in that category. So if I said we don't want any gay people immigrating to the U.S., well, crap, there are gay people in the U.S., And what are you communicating to those people who are already there? You're saying, you're second class or worse. Okay, so great. I'm going to screen share again back here. Great, but that response to the objection doesn't quite, you might have this worry about that response. If you want to think about it on your own, pause the video. But here are my thoughts on it. You might think that doesn't go far enough. And here's why. What about a country, maybe in this day and age, there's no such